样子表概念。
哦。对对对。哎，你包了那个，你包了云的吗？云优那老师可能看到我的问题确实问的太简单了，都不屑于回了。
没有，他那个。
我之前隔一层那个。
没有，我说他直接发错了。要我就给他发了2箱了，昨天中午才回。他没那么快。
但是那上次我隔一层那个没了，他当时很快。
有这样一个。
对对，他是看你干不了他，确实。但这个问题，他的语音弱智，他就不回了。
他可能正在想怎么回答你。
对。
主播家，你在看地址了吗？
你把他 PPT 还打出来了，你把他 PPT 还打出来了。
想带电脑吗？
邮箱啊。
每个老师都说。
啊，我会传到 YouTube 上。
那很好啊。
对。
那干嘛？你这样是在告诉
这不是我问过的，有的人我问过，说可以。因为咱们
家真不老。
在屋里还。
Okay, let's WebArchitecture. Let's get going. So, next in our topic is the idea of style sheets. We're going to talk about two types of style sheets. We're going to talk about CSS and XSL. Who's heard and used CSS? Heard of and used CSS? Who has heard of and used XSL? Okay. Very few of you. Practically we'll mostly just be using CSS in this course, but we are going to talk about what XSL allows us to do as part of this lecture, just so you have the awareness of it. Because it's actually quite powerful. I've had a lot of fun with one of the XSL elements, the XSL C. And we'll talk about that and why it's powerful towards the in the second half of the lecture.
Ricky, can you turn your mic on? I can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
No, well,
Hello? Should I speak louder?
Yes, please.
I'll project to the back of the room. Okay! CSS and XSL. The first thing that we really need to discuss is why we're doing this in the first place. The backing behind this is something called the separation of concerns. It's used a lot in software engineering. It's probably a term that you may have heard elsewhere. Can anyone tell me what the separation of concerns is? What does it mean? Has anyone heard of separating concerns? Hands up. Okay, what do we think it means? Go on.
Just as I guess it's like compartmentalising the different areas. So you've got HTML for the kind of semantic structure, you've got CSS for the visual side. Is it kind of keeping everything distinct?
Absolutely. It's about compartmentalising is a very good word. It's about reducing the need to worry about particular things to like one area. And in this case, we use slightly different technologies to provide each part. And also because we're grouping it because we're compartmentalising it, it actually means that different people can work on those parts. And in the case of HTML and web technologies, the skills involved at each stage are actually quite different. So how do we break this down for a web page? Well, our data gets stored in those markup languages that we spoke about a couple of weeks ago, so HTML or XML. That represents a document. That is something that is achievable and done by someone who has knowledge and interest in that data. So if it's sort of narrative text document, then the author of that would represent their information in HTML. But then we separate out how that's presented to the person who's viewing this, like how it's formatted on a page, how it displays on the screen, what it looks like when it prints out, to a different technology, which we call style sheets, and to a different person a lot of the time. So by separating those concerns, we can leave the person who is good at creating the content to be in charge of the data and doing the markup of that data. But we can have someone who is good at design and someone who's good at sort of visual presentation to focus on the visual style of that part of the page. And therefore those are separate jobs and they can be done independently, and you just bring the artifacts together and then you get a presented page. Obviously there's some overlap and just like negotiation to happen there. But the idea is that they can be independently developed and brought together. The third part that we haven't really spoken about at all in the course that is core to web pages is interactive behaviour. So this is sort of dynamic HTML, JavaScript enabling your page to react to what the user does in real time. So rather than having to go to the server and make a change and then respond with a different data, interactive behavior JavaScript allows you to have pages that will respond to the user's input as they're doing it. But today we're focusing on visual style, so we're going to have a look at some of the technologies that let us do that. I'll talk briefly about what those formats are like, but we'll do some practical stuff about it tomorrow in the lecture on, what is that? That's in the afternoon, 5 o'clock tomorrow. 5 o'clock, 4 o'clock? Afternoon tomorrow. Come along tomorrow, whenever that lecture is, and we'll talk about, or we'll do some demonstrations with CSS. So, first off, HTML style sheets, CSS. This is the technology that allows you to change what a web page looks like, what an HTML document looks like when it's presented in the browser. And in fact, when it's presented through other media. So you can change which particular style sheet is used depending on whether you're showing it on a screen or a projector or on paper or a mobile phone or so on. So you can have different visual styles defined for each of the different contexts. The way we get access to this in HTML is that we use a particular tag, a particular element that will link in our style sheet. That tag is called link, and the really important bit is the href. So link href, and you put the name of the file that is our style sheet, and that will include that within the processing of this HTML file, and that will allow us to modify what that file looks, or what that looks like when it's rendered. Note that this goes in the head tag, so it's not something that's displayed. It's something that's used to do display, but the style sheet itself isn't produced onto the screen. It is metadata about this HTML document.
What about the path to the file? The path to the file.
So this, that goes between there. Yes, it can be either. So it's a URI, so as long as the browser can resolve it to that file, then it will find it. So yeah, in this case, it assumes that that file is in the same directory as that one.
Yeah, it doesn't say that in here.
Sorry?
It doesn't say that in here, that is what I mentioned.
Okay. So it's any valid URI. We've spoken about URIs before, and they can be relative and they can be absolute, they can be to a file, they can be to a HTTP server, they can be to a Gopher server. As long as it is a valid URI, then that will resolve, it will go and get that file. There are a couple of other ways of putting this, our style sheet, in our HTML. I encourage against them mostly because they sort of break that idea of separation of concerns. In this situation, because the style sheet is a completely separate file, it truly allows that ability for two people to work on it at once without sort of other technologies to allow two people to work on something at the same time. But there are other ways of putting style sheet information in, and it can sometimes be useful to be aware of these. One is that there is a style tag, style element, and within that you put your CSS code, and we'll talk about what that looks like in a little while. And again, remember that that's in the head tag. I think most browsers will detect, like if you put it anywhere in the document, most browsers will detect it and deal with it. But it's not really, it's bad practice to scatter your page full of style tags. Keeping it all in one place is much better practice. And traditionally you had to define what type it was in case you were using some other form of styling, but the HTML5 spec now says that is optional and the default is to go to text/CSS. So if you don't put that in, then most modern browsers will realise it's CSS. Now, so this is CSS that will apply to the entire page. The previous one was CSS that will apply to the entire page, but there is also an approach for applying CSS just to one particular element. And the way you do that is you put some CSS code inside the style attribute. So in this example, we've got an H tag and then an attribute style, and the value for that attribute is some CSS. And that styling will only apply to that particular tag. It will only change that heading, in this case to change the color to red, the foreground color to red. Again, this really breaks the separation of concerns. It makes it a little bit harder to be consistent as well. So if you wanted all of your heading ones to be red, following this approach means that if you've got 100 heading ones in your document, because you've got like an entire book representing your page as an entire book, then you've got a lot of places to update that when your designer decides that they want all the heading ones to be blue. So you've got 100 places to change that. The joy and the benefit of this approach and the previous approach, this one, is that we get to have one definition of what we want our heading 1 to be, using the syntax that we have for CSS. And that will apply to all heading 1s within the document. So if you then ever have to change it, if you ever wanted to change our heading to be blue instead of red or purple or whatever, you've only got one position to change it. And again, it's a good practice in terms of development of these sort of things. Trying to isolate the places that you have to make changes massively reduces the number of bugs you get from human error, effectively. As soon as you make something the human's job to go and find all the places that it occurs in, you increase the likelihood that someone's going to make a mistake or miss something or forget.
Ricky, can you have a kind of sense of that at the top we're defining header colour equals red, and then
Say that again, sorry?
can you define things in there which you can then change later, so give you a definition of header colour which is red today, which tomorrow might change to be yellow, and then that's it.
So do you mean could it be different throughout the document? So some of the heading 1s are red and then some of them are yellow.
Yeah, so I might choose to have 3 different header colours.
Absolutely. I'll speak about the attribute that lets us do that. But indeed, what you have to do is mark up your tags as being different versions of this tag. So you might have the heading 1s that are part of chapter 1 and the heading 1s that are part of chapter 2 and the heading 1s that are part of chapter 3. You'll label them with something called the class tag attribute, which we'll see in a second, and that will allow you to refer to each of them individually. So absolutely, yeah, you can have more control than just talking about all of the tags. Now we can still apply these style sheets, the CSS style sheets to XML, in the same way that we were with HTML, because you're just referring to elements. You're still referring to elements and what you want them to display as. And most browsers will take a piece of XML like this and be able to apply a CSS style sheet to it and have an effect. So let's have a look at. If this is our example of an XML, we've got a book and it's got a chapter inside of it and a paragraph. But hopefully we can see this isn't HTML. This isn't a document we normally expect to render in a browser. And if we had no styling information, our browser would render that as XML. We could just see the text of that. But if we do apply CSS, and this is some example of CSS, I'll talk through what the syntax is like in a second. But we have various bits of styling for each of those elements that we had in there, and then we'll result in something like this, where it is a rendered styled version of that data, as opposed to just HTML, the XML version of that. Now, the important bit. What is the syntax of CSS, or the sort of practical bit? And we'll go through some examples of this and see them live and changing as we're going tomorrow. But what's our syntax look like? So, the first thing we have to be able to do in CSS is tell the browser which, or the renderer, which element we're talking about styling. So which of the tags are we referring to when we want to define the style. And we do that with something called a selector. And CSS selectors can get very, very complicated and specific to allow some really powerful things. Like the example of being able to pick every, like certain groups of headings to be different colours is sort of the beginning of that. But there are even sort of recent selectors, or relatively recent selectors, that will let you do things like every odd heading and select those and make those a certain colour. So you could have every odd and even heading be a different colour, or maybe you want the final one to be a different colour, or the first one to be a different colour, or all the ones that have a child that is a paragraph. So you change the style of those ones, but not the ones that don't have a child as a paragraph and things like that. There's some really, really detailed CSS selectors, and there's lots of references to those. So if you go and look on, so we've linked to Mozilla's docs, but the W3 Schools docs about CSS selectors is really, really detailed as well. And just being, like, a lot of them you won't use very often, some of them you'll never use, but it's worth being aware of the scope of those and what is possible. So I suggest, I'll talk through some of the sort of, the ones that are most common, but it's worth going to look at that list and seeing what the range of possibilities are. In fact, maybe we'll have a look at that tomorrow as well, and play with some of them in the practical session. Now, the most basic of all the CSS selectors is an element name. So, for example, if we wanted to, so we're still in the XML example, but with the XML title tag, if we wanted to style that, we would just refer to the name of that element. If we wanted to style H1, we would have H1 as the selector. If we wanted to style a paragraph, all the paragraph tags, we'd have P as the selector. So whatever the element name is, that if you just want to style all of those consistently, then you use just the name of that element. You might want to style multiple things in the same way. Again, similarly, you use the element names, you separate them with a comma. So if we wanted to style all the title, paragraph, and chapter the same, we list them together. Something that goes a little bit deeper than that is providing context for a particular tag. So if you want to get if you want to style the title tag, if it's in a chapter, so if you want to style all the paragraph tags in an article but not in the header and the footer, you refer to the element that's the parent and then the element that's the child in order with a space between, and that allows you to select sort of certain depths within your DOM model, and it will only it's only when it finds that grouping, that pairing, that it will apply the style. So if we only had styles for each of these, title would only be styled in these ways if it's in a chapter or if it's in a book or if it's inside an author and a name, but it wouldn't if it was just a title tag on its own of the root. As I say, there's tons more of these selectors that let you be really, really specific about the context, and I recommend going and have a look at those. What is really, really useful as well is the idea of being able to identify either groups of tags, and that might be the same tag as a group, or it might be a lot of different tags as a group. And you do that with the class attribute. So it requires you to change the markup. It does require you to change the data to help identify these. Otherwise you've got no way from the style sheet language of being able to communicate that. But if we set the class attribute, in our paragraph tag, for example, we have a class equals important, that then becomes the selector within our style sheet language. And the way we refer to that to make it distinct from just an element name is we put a full stop, a period, at the start of that word. And now dot important refers to all elements, and it selects all elements that have that as a class attribute. The important thing to note is that lots and lots of different tags can have this. You can have any types of tags that have that class, and you can have as many or as few as you want that have the class that you're labeling. It's just for you to be able to select within the style sheet. A selector on a similar note is the identifier, the ID tag. So paragraph ID equals something, so this one allows you to refer to a specific element. The idea being that this value is unique per element, so no other element is meant to have this. You can do it and sort of get away with it, like the browser won't throw your page away, it will still render it, but you'll get behaviour that's not necessarily as you'd expect. So you should try and keep these unique, running it through like a verification program to check your document is a good idea and will help you find places where you may have done this wrong. So this allows you to refer precisely to just this tag, regardless of what type it is, so whether it's a H or a paragraph or an H1 or something like that. ID lets you say, this exact element, I need to be able to link to that and make some style on top of it. The way you do that is with the hash symbol, the pound symbol, however you want to call it, and then the name of the ID. And that allows you to select just that very specific element, and that lets you apply formatting and style to that. Now, once you have selected, you then need to be able to say what you're doing with the styling. So, and the syntax for that is that you'll have a selector, so H1. You might even have a H1 that you want all the classes of. So H1.chapter1. So maybe we set chapter 1 to some of the headings, and we want to do something. Then after you've got your selector, then you have an open curly bracket. That's that one. Then you have some CSS declarations, and then you have a closing bracket. Now, what do those declarations look like? And what's the format for those? Well, they look like this, and these are some examples of typical ones. The format for this is that you have the name of a particular thing that you want to modify, such as, really simple example, the colour. So we want to change the foreground, the front colour of this. Then a colon, so 2 dots, and then a value that you want to modify it with. And really, especially if you're doing long lists of it, there should be a semicolon at the end to say that you've finished that statement. So, name of the property that you want to change, colon, then the value that you want to change it to. And these are keywords that are defined by the CSS spec, mostly informed by the browsers and what they want to be able to change, and what they're able to change technically. And the values that go after them also follow a certain specification, a certain range of values. So the named colours, there are a certain set of those. If you search for a CSS list of colours, you get all the different names that you could call a colour. And then, depending on what the property is, so if the property is a font size, like something like font size, there are obviously a certain set of numbers and definitions for that, or ways of describing that size. So font you could describe in point sizes, but you might also describe in number of pixels high, or number of centimeters, or inches, and so on. There are different measurements that you can use to define this. And then things like font style, that has a subset of possible words that you can put afterwards to define that, whether it's italic or normal, and so on. There are lots and lots of these properties. They refer to different parts of a page that you might want to customize and style. Again, it's worth looking up some references for this. W3 Schools and Mozilla's documentations have full sets of these, and they'll categorize them into the different types of formatting and styling that you might want to do. Something like this is not even anywhere near the scope of all the different things that you can style within a page. But doing things like affecting what the font and the text looks like, changing the color of the background and the foreground, and changing the sort of the display of the text, like alignment or uppercase and things like that, are very typical, very common. Yeah. You can also style and change the formatting of how things lay out on the page. And this is where things like the margin and the border and the padding come in. Now, in terms of that, it's worth being aware there is something called the CSS box model, which defines how browsers handle this. And when you're designing a page and trying to lay it out, having an understanding of how the box model works is important to be able to lay it out how you want to. And without full understanding of that, you will sometimes come up against problems where you think you've laid it out how you expect, but then when you render it and look at it in a web browser, it looks nothing like what you hoped for. Now, the box model defines these three different parts of the area surrounding your content, so whether that be text or an image or a video or so on. And what it says is that where your content is, you then have a region around that called padding, then a region around the padding called the border, and then a region around the border called the margin. And effectively what each of those values do is, well, the padding separates the content from the border, so if you want to put space around the content before the line that outlines it, then padding is the right property to use. And if you then want to push other content, so text next to it or images next to your text, away from the border of your around your content, then you use the margin to push those away. And you can define like you can define like the up margin and the down margin, the left margin, the right margin separately, or you can have them all be the same value and so on. The other thing to be aware of about the box model is that there are ways of change. Some elements act as certain types of objects within the display when relative to the box model, and you can change that through CSS. There is a property called display, and its two main values are either block or inline. Although you can use display none to make something completely disappear. But block or inline is what defines what happens with the box model. So if you go display block, if you make an element display block, that will create a new box following the previous block of content. So if our next bit of content after the word content was a new display block element, it would appear either next to or underneath, depending on the amount of space available. Display inline will keep something within a block. It will continue it along within the current block until the next time it finds an element that is of type display block, and then that will become a separate block that has its own sort of area. Yes. So there are some. All elements within HTML have a definition as to whether they start as display block or start as display inline. So, what's a good example? The paragraph tag is a block tag. So when you get to the end of a paragraph and you have another element after that, that will be a separate block. That'll be a separate box following the paragraph tag. An image will be a block tag. What will be in line? So something like emphasis or strong, something that has to go in line with some other text and be able to follow on or have other content follow on from it would be in line. And when we spoke, we briefly mentioned the idea of a div tag and a span tag. Those are HTML tags that have no semantic meaning, but a div tag is a block by default, and a span tag is in line. And they just allow you to mark up something even though you're not putting any semantic meaning on that. So we have an example. Again, an XML one rather than an HTML one. So if we've got a card, it's got a name inside of it, a title, an email, phone number. We could write some CSS to style different parts of that. So you'll see the key bits here are that we have the selectors, which in this case are all quite simple selectors. They're all just selecting the element that we were referring to before. And then we apply a bunch of CSS statements, which are property, colon, value, then semicolon, and then we've got another one, property, colon, values, semicolon, property, colon, value. And in the card example, we're saying definitely display this as blocks. This has to be an independent thing, so any other cards that follow it will flow underneath. We want the border to be red, so we use the border property. We define that it's red and that it has the size 2 millimeters, and that's why we end up rendering quite a thick border around it. And that we want to fix the width of it, so we end up with a block that's 4 inches wide when it's displayed on the screen. We do that for a bunch of them. The best thing to do to get a sense for this is to take these slides, copy that into an HTML or an XML file with a link tag on it, or a style tag, and then copy that inside the style tag after this lecture and see how it lays out, see what happens. Then maybe try changing some of these values. Change them, and if they have an effect, then you've made a correct change. If they don't have the effect you expected, go and investigate why that was. Try and find out what the value was that you got wrong. Okay, right, that's CSS style sheets. I'm going to do about 10 minutes describing what XML style sheets are. Are there any questions about CSS? Probably got time for one or two if there is anything. As I say, we'll do some practical examples tomorrow, talk through what does it actually look like when we put it into practice, and what are the bits that we can change, how can we experiment and play with it. Because really the best way of understanding what's going on here is to both try changing things and see what breaks, see what effect you have. Also to look at other people's. So like opening up a web browser on a reasonably simple page and seeing what their CSS does, and trying to connect the dots between what it says in the CSS and what you see on the screen can be really valuable. Okay, XML style sheet. This is a type of style sheet that we use mostly for data. It actually serves two purposes. So whereas CSS just does formatting of an HTML document, XML can both format and transform the document. And by transform I mean change. It can change it from your regular input XML document into a different XML document, which might be a different XML document in a different XML language. So if it's got a different DTD, if it's a slightly different format that you want to convert to, XSL serves its purpose. It might be that you're converting from your original XML version into an HTML page so that you can publish it on the web more easily. And in fact, the way XSL works, and sort of the reason I really like it, is you can convert it from convert things from an XML document into any other text document. So you can do weird things like take an XML document that represents a journal paper and have it transform into LaTeX, which you can then compile in LaTeX to to get a paper out the other end or an article out the other end. What else could you do like that? You could do wacky things like convert your XML document into ASCII art or something like that, depending on what your XML was, because you can have it output any sort of text information. So as I say, because it provides those two parts, the original XSL spec had support for all of this, all within one spec, and they decided that actually it was easier to, or clearer, to separate that out into a couple of different specs. And those are XSL FO, formatting objects. That's an XML language for describing how to lay out this page, how to format the page, and style that data. And XSLT, which is an XML language vocabulary for transforming one XML into another XML or into any other text, as I was saying. So this results in a theoretical using of these technologies, which isn't always, well, I'll show you on the next slide, that isn't always how things are practically done. But the theory is that we can start with one XML document, so mydoc.xml, and that should have a DTD. This is the document, the dictionary almost, that tells you what each of the elements in there are expected to be. And we'd have one of these XSL style sheets that is going to do some transformation for us. We then transform our XML document using a bit of software called an XSLT processor, and that will output a different XML document, which is ready to be styled, a styled version of that document. We then pass that through the XSL processor to result in a web page or a mobile page or a printed document. The idea being that we can start with the same bit of data, but depending on which styling we do, we get different versions of that at the end of it. The reality is that if that is done, it's typically that the XML document is loaded by the browser. The browser does all of that transformation. That will spit out an HTML document that the browser then renders, basically always as a web page. It's rare that it will do any of the other things. Changed from a mobile page into a WAP page. I think you can read that. Does anyone remember WAP? Yeah. Wow. Wow. How do you remember WAP? Because we forced it all out that way. So yeah, in reality, most things are quite HTML focused. But there's this theoretical underpinning that you could run things as from XML and pass it through this various steps of processing to get a variety of different style results at the end. Now, how do XSL style sheets work? They're actually quite an interesting syntax and structure, and they work on matching elements. So the way you define an XSL style sheet is you have this XML that says to the processor, find me all the elements that match this selector. It's a little bit like CSS in that sense, that you can specify what you want to access, but it's very much based on selecting elements within the document and where they are relative to other elements. And after you've done that, you then provide the text to replace it with, which might contain parts of the original element, but it might also contain entirely new elements. So what does that look like? So here we have, style sheet is our root tag, our root element to tell us that we're in a style sheet. You'll see we then define a bunch of these elements called template. And a template is what's doing that, is doing the matching and then telling the processor what to replace it with. So in this case, the match attribute, these ones here, are telling the processor what to look out for in the original document, what to look out for in the original XML. And then the content of that element, so between the opening template tag and the closing template tag, is what we replace it with. And in this case, we've used some very short content in there, but you can have entire documents of text within there. You could be replacing things with massive amounts of data content. So this example is imagining an XML document where you have a rule element, where you have a new line element, and you have an expletive element. So that might be your document would have a rule, singleton, it might have a expletive, I didn't think it was appropriate to be too rude with that expletive. And then when the XSL processor goes through this, it will find each of these and replace it with what's in there. And what's happening in this example is it's actually converting that XML format into XHTML. So it's finding these things that the XML, the imagined XML language is defined as rule tags and replacing them with HR. That's the heading rule that is that's used in HTML to draw a line across the page. And they're replacing new lines with BR, that's a break tag, again that's an XHTML tag to enable you to move things onto a new line. And this case, this isn't turning it into XHTML, but it is changing what is in the content by looking for things that are inside the expletive tag and replacing them with something that's hiding what exactly that word was. So, what I think is really neat about this is that it's not just, like it seems fairly simple at the matching stage, but there's a lot of power because it has things like loops and repetition. So you're able to select meet all of the list items within this section and do something to all of them. And because of that sort of that repetition and the way it also has a bit of support for variables and things like that, it's actually a true and complete language. It's as powerful, it's as theoretically powerful, maybe not practically powerful because it's harder to do things like this in it, but it's theoretically as powerful as any other programming language. So you can do as much in it as you could in Python or Java and so on, or you can solve all of the same problems at sort of this mathematical level. And because that's really powerful, you can do some really, really neat things with it. But it can get a bit complicated. It can be a bit confusing. So, right, pros and cons just to wrap up. CSS is simple. It's fairly simple compared to XSL, but it's very, very good for HTML documents. It's very specialized. It's very good at helping you format HTML and render it on the page, render it on the screen. The problem is it doesn't let you make any modifications to those documents. It will just display that document. It has the option to not display something with display none. So effectively it's just about displaying that document. And it's not particularly good for XML documents. It doesn't have the benefits of that. CSS and CSS2 and CSS3 make steps towards supporting these things, but not all of them. XSL, very, very powerful, but because of that very, very complex to program, and it's not particularly great just for doing documents. Possibly, it's overkill for just dealing with documents. But if your file, your input content, your XML is a huge database, then it can be very, very appropriate for processing that into a format that is worthwhile displaying. And as we saw, it has the ability to transform and change documents. So you can actually modify them into a new artifact at the end of it. Right, that's the end of the lecture. If there's any questions, I'll take them now. Or now, I'll be around for it. We'll do some of this practice tomorrow.